Wow. I knew we'd talk about this at some point, but I kind of hate having to do this. Just, at the end of the day, war and bombs are horrific, and people, even if you don't like their governments, are still people, and it's kind of horrifying to see. But Israel launched attacks on Iran last night to get rid of the nuclear capabilities. So we're there.
And taking out with great precision a lot of the leadership structure of the IRGC, and I heard, like 6 or 8 of the top nuclear scientists that they have working on their enrichment and weaponization program. And the intelligence operation that led up to that, hearing bits and pieces, I haven't seen a full description, was Mossad has flipped a bunch of agents over the years or the last couple of years, and they were able to lure a lot of these targets into a fairly concentrated location and take them out with precision strikes last night, which is stunning in its sophistication and intelligence. But if we think back to the cell phone attack.
The cell phone pager. Yeah.
Right, pager attack. And the patience and the planning and the black nature of it all, where there's seemingly little awareness of what's going on in terms of the intelligence that's supporting ultimately what becomes very obvious in the form of a massive strike on these strategic targets, which Israel has reiterated that this is military, it's not political. And I just heard a piece with he's actually of Iranian descent, an Iranian Jew who was with the IDF in Israel and lives in Israel, saying that the civilians and the population in Iran are our brothers and sisters. This is against a terrorist regime that has explicitly vowed to exterminate us, and we're taking the steps we feel is necessary to defend ourselves and make sure that doesn't involve weapons of mass destruction.
So at least initial first reports from what I've read is, to your point, they went after strategic targets, nuclear in nature. Doesn't look like they've touched oil fields or oil infrastructure. And we've talked on BDE historically about that. Do you take out oil infrastructure and then leave the Iranian people, who you don't have a beef with? I mean, it truly is just their government. Leave them with no means to in effect rebuild their lives if somehow you're able to topple the government. The question I had, and Mark, have you seen anything on this, is so they targeted nuclear facilities. Don't they need bunker buster bombs to be able to do that? Isn't all this stuff deep underground? And I don't think, the reports I've read, no one said that there have been bunker busters.
I think there have been some involved just because of the nature of those meeting places or the places where they're conducting enrichment. Although I did see one talking about, I think it was the head of the IRGC, the general Salami that heads the IRGC. They showed an apartment building, and it had to be 10 floors up, that was obliterated by a precision missile. But I do think that there's probably some, if not significant, bunker busting capability, because a lot of this stuff, I believe, happens underground.
Yeah.
and so, it's been very targeted. I did see something in the back and forth earlier this morning about, Israel's red line is civilian targets, which clearly this indiscriminate lobbing of 100 or so ballistic missiles into Tel Aviv and other population centers is certainly intended to cross that line, and some insinuation that an appropriate retaliation by Israel would be on oil and energy infrastructure. But I haven't seen that verified by any sources or data points. So I do think that there's an international or diplomatic fine line that the Israelis need to walk here, because you do have an at-risk civilian population that has been suffering under this regime for going on 47 years now. And so to do anything to create a significant humanitarian crisis would be, I think, that'd be a difficult position, just given, what we've seen and heard coming out of Gaza, et cetera. So I don't know that the Israelis are going to wantonly try and wipe out just the necessities or the sustenance that the Iranian people need. Although, as we were talking before we started recording, the poly market has the risk of the Iranians taking out or shutting in the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's seaborne oil flows or is transported, has gone up to 45% in the poly market. This feels somewhat like the good old days, if there are such things, of risk premium. I mean, it was pretty breathtaking to watch crude approach 78 last night. It settled back in. It's up about $5 in the 73 and change range. Last I looked, there was an immediate statement out by the IEA suggesting that while the oil markets are well supplied, we have a significant global strategic reserve of 1.2 billion barrels ready to respond to limit economic disruption. And for some reason, that motivated an immediate response from OPEC saying, that kind of false alarm notification or press release is unhelpful. It contributed to volatility back in 22. And I think what OPEC is really saying is that we don't want, for political reasons, to see this massive release of emergency stockpiles that would then, create a lot of downward price pressure for OPEC in the midst of its cut restoration program. So a lot of moving pieces. Nobody really knows. Equities
so
on the
a couple of things I found interesting. When you look, you're right, oil's kind of $73, $74 a barrel right now. That's where it shook out. The 60-month strip, so the 5-year strip, is still under $64 a barrel and was barely up 1%, just over 1%. The 48-month strip, so the 4-year, up 1.5%. 36-month strip, up about 2%. So, to some degree, we're still in this massive backwardation, and at least the market, by pricing, is telling you, this is going to be a short-lived thing. They're going to throw bombs at each other, and it's going to get over pretty quickly. And then the other interesting point that I wanted to bring up, because I had James Costa-Hertz on the podcast back in December of last year. He called this. He said, we're at our closest point of Iran and Israel going to war, and he said, I think it happens, and it's just not priced into oil. He said actually the 20% of the oil going through the Strait, he said all you have to do is threaten to do something, and no ship owner is going to send their ship through there, even if bombs don't go off. All you got to do is kind of rattle your saber there. So I think you got two things you're kind of watching for then, that and the fact we're in backwardation.
Well, it is a major pathway to imports for the Iranian people and the Iranian government. So, if something like a blockade were to materialize militarily, you're putting a lot of pressure on the Iranian regime. You've got essentially 1.6 to 1.7 million barrels a day of exports that are mostly making their way to China. Do you put more pressure on there? We talked about it a few months ago, right after the new administration took office, that they're really going after the dark fleet that has been moving illicit Iranian barrels around in the market. So I actually think maybe the anticipation of this was something that was in OPEC's calculus to maybe do some of this accelerated cut restoration, because they certainly don't want to. We're not in the best global demand resilience situation relative to a few years ago or pre-COVID. OPEC always watches demand, and so I think they want to mitigate that as much as possible. But the notion that there can't be, and Javier Blas talked about this in a piece. I haven't read it. I read the summary in his tweet, but basically pointing out that maybe we ought to think twice about the complacency that there could be some scenario in which there is a significant or major supply disruption in the Middle East, which is something we haven't seen manifest in the market in quite a while. And what that means for price action and volatility to the upside, remains to be seen. We've kind of joked about it in the past, all these global conflicts and things that would seem to disrupt global crude and product flows have been met with a big shoulder shrug. And, a lot of times we end up trading lower on the day than we did the day before. Once the event is known and is assessed in terms of what type of impact and how far and how long that impact is going to last. This feels a little bit different.
Yeah, it does feel different. The one thing I think the next thing I'm sitting watching is what's the Iranian response. It appears to be going on right now. There are some reports of bombs actually making it on the ground in Tel Aviv, like you were talking about earlier. But at the end of the day, they only shot 100 missiles at Israel, and so it's going to be interesting watching that, because that was the big question: is just how much does Iran truly have left in the tank?
Well, they have thousands of missiles. Report that I heard. The issue is, from a launch capability standpoint, I suspect they've been degraded pretty significantly on their fixed launch sites, which is why this reporter was talking about, a lot of these are being fired from mobile launchers, which you can't move them and reload them or rearm them as quickly as you can a fixed site where you have this huge stockpile of missiles that you can just launch one after another. And so they're having to scurry around for fear of being located and targeted and taken out. So a lot of this, at least the way I think about it, is being done on a bit of a Band-Aid and barbed wire strategy. But they do apparently have stockpiles of still thousands of those ballistic missiles. So I think what we could expect in that model, if you will, is batches of these things. It's 50 to 100, a couple of waves of 50 simultaneously. Is that the peak of their capability, and how much overwhelming force that they can bring given their degraded capability? Because not only was the Israeli campaign designed to take out the nuclear enrichment sites, but it was also targeted at ballistic capability, whether that's missile stockpiles or fixed launchers. I'm not sure, but that thinking about it in that way, where they're having to use kind of a guerrilla type missile launching capability makes sense.
And I would think you can't get too set in your position, because the second they see where the mobile site is, boom, you're either shooting a bomb at it or sending a jet at it. But it didn't look like Iran had anything in the way of air defense systems going.
Yeah, I don't know what at those military sites, those nuclear sites, what the anti-aircraft or surface-to-air missile capability was, but I have to believe the intensity and just the density of the strikes that were going on in the first night of action last night were multifaceted in their targets and probably designed to take a lot of that defense capability out around those sites as well as the sites themselves. So one thing that I was thinking about, and I did some searching on it, and remember that Israel gets about 80% of its gas supply, which is the predominant power generation fuel, from those two Chevron platforms. They're legacy Noble Corporation platforms or Noble Energy platforms in the Med that essentially supply 80% of the country's natural gas, and there's 100 to 120 kilometer network of pipes and subsea manifolds. I would imagine that as a strategic target is well protected, but none of the evidence that I could find, or none of the research that I did, suggested any kind of fortification of those platforms. I did hear one time long ago that they've got 50 caliber machine guns, but that's probably for any random pirate attacks. But that's a theoretical or hypothetical point of vulnerability. I just haven't heard a lot of talk about. But you got 80% of your gas supply concentration in those two facilities is it's got some elevated risk profile. You could contemplate doing some things subsea, certainly surface ships, et cetera, but they've got it well patrolled and well defended.
Oh, and that's interesting. That's put all your eggs in one basket and really, really watch that basket. I bet.
There's a lot of gas out there.
So how do you see this playing out in terms of where does it go? I'm going to force you to look in your crystal ball, and I'll look into mine too. But what do we think happens?
So Dan tweeted out as this was getting underway, what does tomorrow bring in terms of Iranian response? Is it targeting of U.S. assets in the region? Is it Saudi? Is it something else, or is it a big nothing burger? I think we've answered whether it's a nothing burger already, because there's more of this to come in the days ahead. But my guess is we're going to see whatever capability they have in their proxies. And one thing I mentioned in a reply to that tweet was, maybe the Houthis try to somewhat indirectly but significantly hurt the U.S. because they are claiming that we're directly involved. The Iranians is the Houthis there on the Saudi Peninsula, trying some stuff from their vantage point. So Iran using its proxies to really harass the U.S. and U.S. allies and interests in the region. I just don't think they have more direct capability to respond than what they've demonstrated. Now, on the flip side, the notion that they were, in some cases, days, based on some experts, to weeks away from having 9, 11, 15 nuclear weapons ready to attach to a missile and fire. Are we sure we've got track of all of that? And are, do they have something there that they can advance very quickly? And so I think Israel is just going to continue to hammer on it to make damn sure that what we couldn't accomplish through the last 60 days of negotiation through diplomacy is going to be done through destruction.
One of the news sources is reporting that Iran has lobbed a phone call into the Trump White House. I haven't seen what was supposedly said or multiple reports of that to know it's true, but that supposedly has happened.
Well, there was supposed to be another, I think, a fifth or sixth round of negotiations between the Iranians and the U.S. in, was it Oman or Bahrain on Sunday? And most people think that that's not going to happen and probably won't. I'd also heard somewhere that, some of those in the negotiating team might have been taken out in last night's strikes as well. So kind of hard to show up if you're not there. If you no longer exist. Yeah. So,
it's so the thing I found really interesting in the very first Iraq war, Iraq launched missiles into Israel and the Patriot missiles shot it down. But somehow the Bush administration was able to kind of hold the neighborhood at bay. Nobody got involved. But what's interesting this time is you've got, on one hand, you had the Abraham Accords, and so you've got, in effect, more peace, if you will, between various players in the Middle East and Israel. But to your point, all that LNG, Israel doesn't have any LNG import. So, doesn't Egypt control those two offshore Chevron fields? So you've got all the natural gas. You don't really have a backup, I don't think, to get in there. So the Egyptians are going to have to play nice.
Those platforms are in Israeli territorial waters. So those are sovereign Israeli assets owned and operated by Chevron.
Oh, okay. So we got some cover there, but Egypt's right next door. They're going to have to play nice. You've got us having probably one of the testiest relationships we've had with Russia, given what's going on in Ukraine. And China always wants to be a snake in the grass. And so I think it's gonna take a lot more in the way of getting the neighborhood to play nice maybe this time than in previous times. And that's what's got me scared is, a bomb goes here, somebody retaliates back. Putin decides he's 73 and he's about to die anyway, so he wants to get involved somehow. That's kind of the dynamics that's worrying me.
Well, the Chinese have shown no hesitation to buy Iranian oil when nobody else is either allowed to or wants to because of sanctions or threat of sanctions. And so, as we've seen in a lot of other places, whatever strengthens Chinese economic power and their strategic security is what they're going to do, like building 2 coal-fired generation plants a week.
Right.
While they build solar and wind. So anyway,
I think we can have equal chances of the Israelis took out the nuclear threat and it's done. Iran doesn't have enough in the way of mustering an attack on the way back. So a lot of saber rattling, but at the end of the day, this blows over in a week. I also don't think it's out of the realm that this is World War III, 3 months from now. And heaven forbid, I hope this doesn't happen. I'm not rooting for it, but, U.S. troops on the ground in the Middle East again.
Yeah, there's 40,000 of them. There's 100,000 Americans who live in Israel. And so, there are 100,000 Americans in Israel. I don't know what permanent residence status versus temporary visiting for work or for family, but we've got significant exposure in terms of people and assets in the Middle East. And keep in mind, a little over a month ago, the president made a pretty prominent swing through key Middle Eastern companies that went very well from garnering support and getting commitments on investment in the U.S. And as we talked about at that time, let's look at economic partnerships to strengthen these relationships and maybe turn the temperature down in the region, where we can come up with some mutually beneficial investment and economic opportunities. And here all of a sudden you've got something that is, again, a flashpoint. I don't think it's, to the experts, I don't think it's all that surprising, because I'm guessing the signals were pretty strong behind the scenes that the Israelis were reaching a point where we've got to do something, because they're getting too close to having a usable or a handful of usable nuclear devices, which I don't think Iran, given its history and its rhetoric, would hesitate to deploy. And so that's.
I mean, they literally have a clock
Yes.
in down. I believe it's in downtown Tehran that is counting down to 2040 or whenever the end of Israel has to happen by.
Yeah.
And so this, it may not be part of the Iranian people's mantra, but it certainly is for their government.
Well, I think to get back a little bit more to the oil markets, there is some related dynamic that we've been talking about, and you predicted, or you have put your stake in the ground, that the U.S. production has peaked. The notion that we may be kind of in warm idle here, getting ready to roll over, was at least supported by the short-term energy outlook that the EIA put out earlier this week, that said, 2025 is going to average a bit more than 13.4 million barrels a day, and we expect 2026 to be a bit less. And where they had earlier projected growth, in the scenario that they used as their base, they didn't contemplate the velocity and the magnitude of drilling activity reductions that we've seen. Well-directed rig counts down another 3 last week. We're down back at 2021 lows. So U.S. shale has played a pretty important shock absorber for supply side risk over the last decade and a half, and certainly through the conflicts that we've seen more recently. And if the market looks at that and says, we can't count on it as much as we did in the last few years, if something were to happen where you have a closure of the strait or an attack that takes out either Saudi capability from production or exporting standpoint, or Iran, then I think we've got a much thinner margin on the supply side, and so I know the president, prior to these strikes and the upward price action, said in his event yesterday, which was related to the rolling back of the EV mandates, the California EV mandates, called out or highlighted the fact that Chris Wright was there, and he didn't really like the fact that prices had come back up from flirting with the 50s. Now we were at, I think, 68 or close to 68 yesterday before all this happened, and so politically it's not a comfortable spot for the administration to be in. But when you combine that with the fact that on the political and military side, what happens if U.S. assets and people are involved and damaged, God forbid, killed or injured, what is going to be our political and military response, if any?
Yeah, no, it's like I said, I really don't like talking about it. I know we have to because of the impact on oil prices, but gosh, it just, I come back. I think you and I have talked about this. I don't know if we talked about it on the air. Is if I'm a dictator, even of a third world country, I think I'm pretty good with all the Cavassier that I could want to drink. And, I'd probably have, multiple wives and I'd have a nice castle, but I'd be pretty benevolent in terms of being a dictator. Taxes wouldn't have to be that high. You'd have a good life. Why do you want to go to war with the great Satan? I mean, what are those people smoking that you would want to do this? And I just don't get it. I guess at the end of the day, FAFO, and maybe they just didn't believe us, but Trump did say you got 60 days, guys.
And at day 61, they're catching bullets, which, I feel for the people that are on the ground in Tehran and just the rank and file citizenry who I think we know from listening to the experts on Iranian society and the population that, this regime being in place as hardline as it gets for almost 50 years, I think people have had more than enough. But what motivates regime change to get the Iranian people back into the global society of civilized countries where their leadership is not hell-bent on things like taking out an entire country's or civilization's population.
I was speaking at a UT Law symposium, and I haven't looked up what year it was. They gave me a little paperweight or something so I can actually go see the year. And they asked for predictions. And even back at Kane, even before I was podcasting, I just said stuff that was crazy and to kind of cause some buzz. And they said they said make a prediction, and I said within the next decade, Iran will overthrow its government, and they will be our strongest ally in the Middle East. And it was kind of funny, and the guy followed up, well, why do you say that? And I said, well, the Iranian people are actually very westernized. Go look at photos from the 70s, before. I mean, that looked like America. And I said, more plastic surgery per capita than any other country on the planet. I mean, they very much, I think, would want to be part of the Western world. It's just that government. So,
yeah, I think this has a little duration on it, measured in several days, if not 2 or 3 weeks. Hopefully we can get back on sides with the negotiations, but they were accelerating their enrichment and weaponization program despite protestations that they weren't. But when you saw, and the president alluded to it yesterday in that White House event, was, we think we have a pretty good agreement that we can get in place. However, the Iranians need to do more. Well, the Iranians' hardline has been throughout all of this, we are not going to stop our enrichment programs. Well, why do you need to enrich uranium? It's to continue on the path of building weapons. And that is, well, there's no compromise there. So,
and I mean, the defense to the Iranians on that is we don't want to be Gaddafi. Look at what happened And to some degree, you could say, look at what happened to Ukraine when they gave up their nuclear ambitions. So it's never want to be in the on the side of defending Iran, but.
So I want to touch on this event yesterday. I watched the better part of an hour and 20 minutes of this press event around the congressional resolutions. There were 3 of them, but the most important one was essentially repealing or rolling back the California EV zero emission vehicle by 2035 mandate. And the reason that's important is that back in 1970, when the Clean Air Act at the federal level went into law, California was granted special status in that they wanted the ability to set more stringent and stricter emissions regulations and fuel efficiency regulations than the EPA would prescribe federally. And so they were granted that exception. They can request waivers and impose stricter regulations, but the other states were given the ability to tag along any approved California measure. And so there were 17 states that were tagging along on the 2035 EV mandate. And it very quickly became, at least in the last decade or two, became way, way outside of the original objective of giving California that state authority to clean up, a pretty significant smog problem that they had back in the 60s and 70s. And, the Clean Air Act did a lot to mitigate that, but now it's way overreaching in terms of, states being able to tag along. And basically it was really a discussion or a case for consumer choice, which, 10 years from now, if I've got to have an ICE vehicle, an ICE-powered vehicle, I can't get one in California. And I've taken that choice out of the consumer's hands. So John Hess made some remarks. They had some trucking and some auto industry representatives who were up there very supportive of what this is doing. So basically, this tag along of allowing California to impose its own stricter regulations that affect not only its citizens, but also citizens across, at least in this case, 17 states. Well, not surprisingly, California and I think 10 of the other states immediately filed suit yesterday. I'm not sure what the details or the basis of the lawsuit was to overturn this repeal
We're mad.
action.
We're pissed. I mean, it seems like there's a lawsuit filed every day on something. So it'll be interesting to watch kind of that play out. I mean, I'm generally a states' rights type guy, and if California wants to do it, it's just going to be a boon for auto dealers in Nevada who will, sell cars and people will drive them across the border because at the end of the day, they won't be able to keep them out. But going to be interesting to watch.
So, it's Friday night, Saturday morning in the Middle East, and as I understand it, there's ongoing operations by the IDF. We'll see what happens over the weekend, and maybe hopefully have good stuff to talk about. That there's some diffusing of the tension and a ramp down in the conflict. But what I've heard and read up to this point, it doesn't sound like that's right around the corner either. So be watching oil markets over the weekend.
Yeah, no, it's going to be wild sitting there watching it, and hate to even have to talk about it and think about it, but at the end of the day, you're right. I hope we find a path to peace, because a lot of people are dying in the world, and it's just not good stuff. So, all right, Mark. Well, good to see you. When you back in Houston?
See you next week. I'm coming in early Wednesday.
Okay, cool.
Be there for about a week and a half.
Okie doke. I may miss you on Wednesday. I'm heading to the AAPL, the Landman Association meeting in Kansas City. I'm actually going to talk AI and do a product demo for the audience.
I'll drink all the beer you don't want. So
there you go. It's all yours. All right, man. Have a good weekend.